My name is Kathleen Noneman, and today is December 16th, 2022. We're in Reno, Nevada. This interview is being brought to you by the Ericson Family Trust Foundation. Today we're interviewing the Honorable Patricia A. Lynch, retired. Good morning, Judge Lynch.
Good morning.
Would you tell us a little bit about your early history and where you were born and where you grew up?
Yes, I was born in St. Mary's here in Reno, Nevada, so that's how I came to this town. And I grew up here my whole life. We lived over on University Terrace and then over on Evans Avenue, so I grew up kind of on the poor side of town, but I didn't know it was the poor side of town because, it was just where I lived, and I had a great group of friends. I went to Orvis Ring, Mary Stoughton, Orvis Ring, and then I went to Northside 1 year before it closed, and then Central, and then Reno High. And
Did your family come to Nevada early on?
Yeah, I'm first generation Nevadan. Okay. Yeah, my mother came from a little town outside of Sioux City, Iowa, and my father came from, he was actually born in Roxbury, Massachusetts, in Boston, which was poor Irish before it was poor black. And anyway, they met at a dance in Sioux City after the war, and then they came here and settled down.
And what brought them here?
He had, during the Depression, he was riding the rails a lot. He went down to the University of Alabama and because it was the cheapest school in the country. And he worked for a while, but he just, he finally dropped out, and he rode the rails and everything, and he just really liked Reno. He kept coming through Reno, and he'd worked in the Silverado silver mine up out of Plumas County, and so he'd kind of been around here, and they just liked it. So they came here and got married, and the fire chief, they came down one day, or he was sitting somewhere, and the fire chief said, "Oh, we need people. Will you come join the fire department?" So that's how he joined the fire department.
So your father was a fireman?
He was a fireman. He retired from the fire department, Reno Fire Department.
And you went to Reno High School?
And I went to Reno High School, yes.
And then to UNR?
Oh, then I went to the University of Nevada, Reno, yes. And I lived at home because I knew I wanted to go to law school. I decided in ninth grade that I wanted to go to law school. And so to be able to afford it, I just lived at home and went to the University of Nevada and got a degree in political science. And then I was fortunate enough to get a scholarship, partial scholarship, and I went to McGeorge School of Law, which is associated with the University of the Pacific in Sacramento. You might remember that there was no law school in Nevada at the time, so you had to go out of state. And so McGeorge actively recruited in Sacramento in the north, and so I got this Nevada scholarship.
And was McGeorge ABA accredited at that time?
Yes, it was.
So they had become accredited.
Yes, it had been the old Sacramento Law School,
Right.
But it was looking for a university, and University of the Pacific was looking for a law school, and it was a perfect match.
And what year did you graduate?
1973.
And what was the climate like when you graduated as far as jobs for women in the legal profession?
Interesting, yes. Well, you were a bit of a novelty. There were 5 women in my class, about 200, so it was just kind of typical of what it was back then. And so I remember I ended up going to legal aid. I wanted to help people. That was why I went to law school. I wanted to help people. And I also felt as a woman, the way I could help people was that I needed to have some power so people would listen to me. And so early on, I decided, well, if I become a lawyer, if I don't like something, I'll just, I can make a change. And so that's, why I went to law school. So I wanted to go to legal aid, and I remember used to have a fitness, I don't know if you remember, you had a fitness and morals interview. Used to have this interview, and they're all, old white men, some of them were very nice, but it is, there was not a lot of diversity there. And they asked me, why I was going to go work at legal aid. And I told them, and they said, well, don't I think I could help people at some of these other places? And I said, I truly don't know. Maybe I could, but it was weird. It was just kind of like they shouldn't have asked me. I could do whatever I wanted to do, but they did. But
And was that legal aid here in Washoe
it was
County?
Washoe, yeah, it's now Northern Nevada Legal, I forget what they
Was
call it.
that, did that become then Washoe Legal
Yes,
Services?
yes, that was the Washoe Legal Aid Society,
Right.
yes. Mhm.
And then it
Yes.
became Washoe Legal Services.
Right,
Yes.
right.
Okay.
But,
And-
oh,
And how long were you there?
I was a year because I was a Vista attorney. So I was making as much as my clients. But when you would go to court, I remember one of the judges called me Portia and asked if I was from the welfare department, because there weren't a lot of women going to court back then, as you know. You could count us on your hand, or two hands maybe,
And so
So-
that's where you got your first experience as a lawyer.
Yes, and you couldn't wear pants to court. One judge really questioned me about who was Mrs. Lynch because I kept my name when I got married. I decided early on I was going to do that, and I told him that was my mother, and it was just an awkward, strange argument or discussion that I don't think would happen now.
Right. So you have always practiced as Patricia Lynch.
Yes, yes.
All right, and then you had an interesting experience of being able to go to Washington, D.C. Tell me a little bit about that.
That was, yes, sometimes things happen for a reason. I'd applied to 3 law schools. I really wanted to get into Davis, and it was fairly new, and I was on the waiting list. Denver sent me back because I was a skier, I wanted to go someplace where I could maybe ski, sent me back a rejection letter, and I thought something was weird about it, and then I realized they didn't have my last name on there, on the letter, and I thought, well, that's not very good. Maybe I don't want to go there. Anyway, but I went to McGeorge, and so there were only 5 of us, and one of my still good friends, Jennifer Moss, her father was Congressman John Moss, and he from Sacramento, and he was 12th in seniority in the House of Representatives, and he's the author of the Freedom of Information Act. So he's a very powerful, wonderful congressman, and so I met the Mosses while I was in law school and everything, and then he actually chaired House Government Oversight, that we all know about that committee at the time, and he got a new position, and so he needed a legislative assistant, and Jennifer said, well, Dad, maybe you should hire a woman. And he said, yeah, do we know any? And she said, well, how about Patricia? And he said, oh yeah, Patricia's great. Give her a call. And so she called me on Friday, and we had to decide, and get back to her, and then we got on a plane and went back, and we lived there 2.5 years, and it was just a fascinating place to work.
Mm-hmm. And you say we.
Oh, my husband, I had married after my year as a Vista, and I had actually volunteered for the Nevadans for the ERA, which was a fairly disappointing experience at the time because the legislature rejected it again. So my husband and I, yes, we moved back to Washington. Well, we lived in Northern Virginia, but worked in Washington, D.C.
And what did you do for Congressman?
I was his legislative assistant. So each congressperson has a administrative assistant who is overall the head of the office, and then a legislative assistant. And then if they're on committees, they have committee staff, and they have other folks. But you're essentially responsible for all of the legislation that the congressperson works on and all of the votes. So every day I would have to do a packet of what was on the floor, what was coming up. In those days, the Republicans and the Democrats worked together, and there were certain offices you would call where they had some expertise, and I remember particularly I think it was on tax matters, we would call one Republican office and say, how's the member voting on this, and you talk about that and everything. So we would do that. I had a security clearance, and he was on the Joint Atomic Energy Committee, so I was, would go to some of those hearings, and that was really an interesting experience.
And
So-
how were you treated as a woman in that position?
Actually, I was treated fairly well, although there still were not that many female legislative assistants at the time. We had it was called, I think it was called the Capitol, we had a women's political caucus, but it was the Capitol Hill Women's Political Caucus. And it was Democrats and Republicans, and they called them Wednesday Republicans. They were even a small group kind of back then. And I don't know why, I guess they met on Wednesdays and caucused or something. And so we met with them, and there were not that many congresswomen even at that time, and they would come to the meetings sometimes. So that was wonderful. I mean, you got to meet Patsy Mink and Shirley Chisholm and some of these folks. It was just exciting.
Right. And was Congressman Moss was a Democrat, correct?
Oh yes, yeah.
And so when you finished that job, did you come back to Reno?
Yes. Then we moved back to Reno, and I worked a little bit for Don Pope. And in private practice, and then I went to the city attorney's office, which was a major influence in my legal career. I was the first female city attorney in that office,
and
hired.
Who was the Reno city attorney
At that time it was Bob Van Wagner.
And he's the one who hired you?
And he hired me, yes. And then a month later, Nancy Ann Leader came, and we were the two, and we were prosecutors. We both had long hair and similar, kind of the granny glasses back then, and they couldn't tell us apart. So, we were always getting questioned about each other's cases and all of these things. So it was interesting, yes.
And what kind of cases did you have?
Well, at that point, you were a misdemeanor prosecutor, and that was actually my introduction to domestic violence, which has become a very important influence in my life and something that I've worked on a lot, as you know. And so we would prosecute first and second domestic violence cases. They didn't have much, I'm not sure that stalking was even a crime back then. It may have been, there's some things like that. Just all kinds of things, drunk driving, a lot of drunk driving, and things down to traffic offenses and things like that.
Judge Lynch, what motivated the city attorney to hire women at that time?
I think maybe it was just time. I don't know, because I had interviewed with quite a few some other entities, governmental entities, and some private law firms, and I wasn't getting any offers. And I think there were starting to be enough women, and I think that that perhaps at that point, Mr. Van Wagner felt that it was appropriate. So I don't know, but he made me the offer, and I was thrilled.
And at that time, were they prosecuting domestic violence, acts of domestic violence?
Not really. I mean, if it was really bad, we wouldn't have had it in the city attorney's office. If it was very, very serious, it would be up at the DA's office. But if it was a provable case, and if the victim wanted to, quote unquote, press charges, which is totally inappropriate, as we know now, because you don't make the victim of the robbery press charges, or the person at the bank press charges, then they would do it. Because it was easy, and it would go, and they would pretty much, I don't want to say they'd have to be a nun, but they'd have to be pretty clean. They have to be clean. They couldn't, have any, they couldn't be an alcoholic or have any kinds of problems. The victim couldn't. And so if she, and it was usually a she, because back then gay people weren't very open and coming out on those things, and if she would agree, then they would go in and prosecute the case. And just a slap on the wrist. We didn't have the mandated penalties that we do today, and everything. And so what happened was you would have the cycle, the constant, as we know, because domestic violence increases with frequency and intensity, and then gets more dangerous. And then when the woman tries to leave, the victim, that's the most dangerous time. So we had these cases going, and we kind of said, this is we're just repeating. We don't feel like we're doing anything. And I remember there were two stories, well, kind of three, but two that really stick with me from the domestic violence cases. And it was a young woman, and she was probably my age. I may have been 23, 24, I don't remember. And she had two little boys, And we met, they used to have these little rooms you would meet in before you'd go in the courtroom, and she said, well, she wanted to drop the charges and everything. Okay, well, we can figure that out and everything. And so I said, okay, we would do that. And then she said, well, now what do I do? I had no answer. I didn't know. COG didn't even exist yet. It was just starting up, which was the Committee to Aid Abused Women, the first shelter for women. There was not a shelter for women. I didn't have an answer for her. And I vowed to myself, I will have an answer the next time this happens. And I felt so bad that I actually remember going up to find her where she lived, and she had moved. And so she's my unknown victim who I work for.
And you still
Yeah.
remember her.
Oh, I remember her, yeah.
And how did the judges treat these domestic violence cases in the beginning when you first brought them?
We had to educate the judges. What happened was a process, and fortunately at that time, Louis Test had run. Van Wagner had retired. Well, actually, he went over and became Justice of the Peace, where I actually ended up. Life is so interesting. But Louis Test was the city attorney, and we talked and said, you know, we need to change this. So we started pressing the charges. We started saying we're going to go in and we're going to prosecute these cases and not let people drop the charges. The problem was we didn't have a safety net. We were kind of not knowing what we were doing, you know. We were trying to be helpful, but, you know, I don't know. And so depending, if we had a nice clean case where the victim didn't have any problems, didn't fight back, you know, because women weren't allowed to be angry or anything, you couldn't defend yourself, then we could maybe win the cases. So we had to educate the judges, and it was a process, and it's still going on today, you know. They were those first couple cases, they were hard. We had them every day. Those first cases were difficult. But we just decided we're just going to keep going in, and we're just going to keep trying these cases, and we're going to educate these judges. And then we did.
Yes.
And it got better.
Was, you and Nancy Ann Leader?
Yes, and there were some male prosecutors in the office too, and
Right.
they got on board and everything. But it's interesting because in my career, I think my strong stance on domestic violence has, you know, has alienated some people because they think I'm gender biased, but I'm not. I'm trying to help victims. If it were a male victim, and there can be male victims, but they're not as many, because it's about power and control and domination is what it is. And so you have to look at the relationship, and then that's well, later on I can talk about creating the victim advocates, and that really helped in the prosecution of those cases.
Judge Lynch, you entered politics. Would you tell us a little bit about running for public office and what that experience was like?
Yes, in 1982, when I was still working in the city attorney's office, the position of Justice of the Peace opened up because on the very last day to file, Bob Van Wagner, who had been the city attorney, was the Justice of the Peace. He filed against Judge Gunderson for the Supreme Court. People talked him into running against Justice Gunderson. And that left the Justice of the Peace open position, and the only people who had filed were like the Xerox repairman and a bailiff and a few other people. And what happened was they called over and asked Louis Test if he wanted to run for it, because he was currently the city attorney, and he said no. And I heard about it, nobody asked me, and I said, I'm going to do that. So I filed. I thought I was the only woman. I woke up in the morning and my good friend Deborah Auguste had filed also. So my first experience was I ran for that position. I won the primary and lost the general to Judge Auguste, and came back many years later and was elected to that position.
So after that loss for the Justice Court, did you then take a break from politics? What did you do then?
Yes. Well, what happened was then. The city attorney, Louis Test, decided he only wanted to serve one term, and so the city elections were in the spring, and I thought, well, maybe I'll run for city attorney. But Bob Van Wagner was defeated by Justice Gunderson and decided he wanted to come back and run. So I met with him, and he said, no, that I could, that if I supported him, he would make me the chief civil deputy, and all of these different things, and it would be a fine place to work. And it had been before, so I had no reason to think that it wouldn't be. And I remember meeting with Frankie Sue Del Papa, who was a good friend of mine, and she said, well, do you have the fire in the belly? And the fire had really gone out because we'd exhausted ourselves. We had 2 young children. We had one in a backpack and one in a stroller when we were campaigning. And I said, I don't think I have the fire in the belly. And she said, well, you don't want to do it if you don't have the fire in the belly. So I didn't run at that time. I then proceeded, Van Wagner got elected, proceeded to work for him.
And when you went back to the city attorney's office, you weren't the only woman there now.
No, that's true. Carol Cook was there, and Barbara Chang was there. And unfortunately, the office was not the same, and Van Wagner was essentially, they started discriminating against the women. He told me I could not be the chief civil deputy because the council did not want a woman, which is not a good reason. You can't do that. That's discrimination. Told Carol Cook, who in the normal progression, she would have been the next criminal deputy, that she couldn't be the chief criminal deputy because she was a woman, and that 40% of the police didn't like her, which was not only bad law, it was also bad math, because that meant 60% did. And that she couldn't relate to the police, and yet she had married a police officer, so I think she related just fine. And then Barbara Chang, they just paid less than the 2 young men that they had just hired, and she had experience, and they didn't. And so eventually we all basically left because we were kind of forced out. And we had people who wanted to sue the city on our behalf, because it was pretty clear, because they just stated the intent right there, but they wouldn't hire us, and that was the hard part. Mm-hmm. So fortunately, Jim Hardesty did hire me, and I'd known him forever, and so I went over there and worked for a while, and then I went to the Attorney General's office, and when I was in the Attorney General's office, I got a phone call from Catherine Wishart, who was on the city council, and she said, would you come back and run for city attorney? Because it was now 1987. And the council, things had gone downhill so much with the legal advice and problems in the city attorney's office that they were looking at trying to make it an appointed rather than elected position. And so I said, oh, well, I don't know. And then I thought, I'm going to. And so I ran for city attorney in 1987.
This time you had the fire in the belly.
And this time the fire was in the belly. And I remember Bill Richardson saying to me after I'd lost the Justice of the Peace race, and he said, this will pay off. This is good experience. And I remember thinking, are you crazy? This was awful. We spent all this money and all this time. And, but he was right. We knew how to run a race. And so that was our first political campaign. And after that, I never lost a political campaign. I think I ran 8 more times.
And you
maybe.
won every time?
And I won every time, and usually by large margins. Mm-hmm. They were never close. Yeah.
So, and then as the city attorney, did that give you the opportunity then to pursue your interest in domestic violence cases?
Very, very much so. What happened, fortunately, is that I had a position that this gal was just gone when I came in as city attorney. She was gone, and she said she was on medical leave or whatever, but she never came back, and we couldn't find her, and the transition was not good.
Who are you talking about then?
Oh, I'm sorry. This was just a person in the criminal division.
Oh.
Just a clerical position.
Right.
But the person had left, and I couldn't find, so I had this vacant slot eventually, and I said, I'm going to create a victim advocate. And I had gone to a city attorney, became very active in this International Municipal Lawyers Association, and I had gone to a lunch conference, and then the luncheon speaker was the city attorney and his victim advocate, and they talked about what they did, and I said, that's what we need to do. And I got their job description. I hired Diane Loper, who was, as many of you know Diane Loper, and I I gave her this information and I said, create this job. This is your job. And she did. And so, patterned after Seattle, we created the first victim advocate on domestic violence in a prosecutor's office. And now they are in every prosecutor's office in the state. And the ones that don't have them in-house, like the smaller counties, they contract with the victim agencies to have support. That is probably my proudest achievement, I think, and had the greatest impact on helping victims.
And then did that area of the city attorney's practice then expand?
Oh yes, it did. We took the cases very seriously, and we really got results. I mean, we heard out on the street that people were saying you don't want to get arrested in Reno, because you'll have to actually do time, and you will, So I feel that we did make victims much safer, and we started providing the resources. We started working with the other agencies. I think at that time we founded the Washoe County Domestic Violence Task Force. I was one of the co-founders, and we were trying to network and do that coordinated community response that they talk about now that is so necessary.
And you were also instrumental in founding the Northern Nevada Women Lawyers Association at that time, is that?
That's true. Well, that was earlier, but yes, maybe it was around that time. What happened was when I moved back from Washington, D.C., from working for the congressman, Frankie Sue Del Papa was moving to Washington, D.C., and she said, here's this survey that I did of the women lawyers. There weren't that many of us. And I think we have enough to form an organization, so I'm turning it over to you. So Frankie Sue Del Papa gave me the survey, and most of the women wanted to form an organization. And so Lindsay Weston, who was with the Public Defender's Office, the Washoe County Public Defender, and Sylvia Thompson, who was one of the older female attorneys in town who did bankruptcy law, and I were the co-founders. And we had so few women that we met in, actually at Mary Sauer's house. Mary Sauer lived in Pleasant Valley. Mary Sauer was not an attorney, but she was a good friend. And she let us use her house. And then that way the women from Carson and the women from Reno could meet, and we had enough to have a meeting. And that was how Women Lawyers started, was back then.
And when did you help to found the Northern Nevada Women Lawyers Association?
That was right after I had moved back from Washington, D.C., shortly after, so it was 1978.
Right. And did you mentioned that you were involved with the international women lawyers and with the municipal attorneys on the international stage. And
yes,
tell us a little bit about what you've done with them.
Well, as city attorney, I became a member of the my peer group, which was the International Municipal Lawyers Association, and it was international because it included the Canadians, and we're based on common law, so the law was, was fluid, and we would understand what was going on in each country. And I fortunately moved up and became the 4th female president of this organization. And I majored in political science. I always had an interest in politics and in history, and I wanted to travel and everything, but I never saw any way that being a local government lawyer would translate into any kind of an international experience. And then the wall came down. And you had all these countries who didn't know how to do local government law. And all of a sudden I became an expert. We were experts. And so my first venture was on a panel when we went to Kyiv, Ukraine in 1998, which was quite compelling. And they had actually moved the conference back from Tbilisi, Georgia, because they felt it was too dangerous in 1998. And so I was able to parlay that and go to a number of places. In 1998, the Ukrainians were concerned about Russia coming in and taking them back. And they'd only been independent, I think, 7 years at that time. and Belarus. They were very concerned about both Belarus and Russia. And so, but they didn't know how local government worked because it had been years, everything was top down. You know, I remember we got there and they hadn't turned the heat on yet for the whole country, the whole city. They turned the heat on October 15th, I think. Yeah, that was the last day of the conference. So anyway, I became an expert, and so that led to some really wonderful opportunities, and I was able to travel to many parts of the world to speak on municipal law. And as part of the International Municipal Lawyers, we would provide panels with the World Jurist Association. That was another group that would have these meetings. That's what this was, the World Jurist Association. And so one particular one I remember was in China. We went to China in 2005, and here's a picture of me in the Supreme Court of China. And the Chinese, of course, wanting credibility, had funded a chief justice from every country in the world, and so I got to meet Justice Kennedy and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, and just some fascinating people. And so you really, had an experience to do something on a much larger scale than you had ever imagined. So I just feel very blessed. And so I've gone to Ireland, Prague a couple times, Kyiv, Shanghai, Beijing, Adelaide, and Sydney, Australia, with these conferences.
And did any of those address domestic violence?
Yes, I remember the panel in in China particularly, and Sherry Blair was on the panel from England, and she was Tony Blair. Well, I'm trying to remember her name because she kept her name too, I think, and I don't want to do that to her. And so she's the Prime Minister's wife, and she did an excellent presentation, and she really got it. It was like, okay, she understands this. And then the Chinese panelists talked about how they didn't really want to offend the men, and so they would do happy family counseling. Somebody asked them, and so they would do the happy family counseling because you want to keep the happy family, you want to keep the man happy, I don't know. Anyway, so it was very interesting. So you had to be kind of circumspect on some of this, but I mean, Sherry just laid it out. I thought it was great. So yes, there were some panels on that. Yes, indeed.
And how long were you Reno City Attorney?
Almost 20 years, basically 19 and a half, because what happened was the city switched its elections. They used to have standalone elections in the spring, as you recall, and then they switched to the fall elections now with everyone else. And so you couldn't shorten someone's term. So what you did is on one term, you ran for 3.5 years. And so like whatever judges were up, myself, and whatever council members were up, we ran for a 3-year term. And then the next cycle, whoever those council members were, or if there were any judges, they ran for a 3.5-year term. And then we all caught up and everything. So it was 19 and a half years, yes.
And how many political campaigns did you have to run as city attorney?
Well, I think I ran 5, because my last one, I left in 2012. So it was from 1987. So I think I ran 5 times. So I'm the longest right now I'm the longest serving city attorney.
And all of this.
And the first female, of course. Yes.
And all of this time, you were also a wife and mother to 2 boys.
Yes.
What was that like?
That was busy. I was really lucky to meet a wonderful companion who is still with me, and I met him on the ski hill, drew stamps. He was from the Bay Area, came up here to go to school, and mainly because he could ski and still go to school. And so, we got married in 1974, and we've since had 2 wonderful boys, Seth and Eric, and now a daughter-in-law, Hillary, and a couple grandchildren. And so that has been a wonderful, very fulfilling part of my life.
And was Drew supportive of your political aspirations?
Yes, very much so. And fortunately, he had the kind of work, he did construction, and basically was his own boss, where he could juggle all of the things that you need to juggle as a family, and essentially was the stay-at-home dad many times, although he still worked, and that's what made it work.
Mm-hmm. And he's a very fine carpenter, I understand.
Yes, he is. Yes, he's still working on our house.
And when did you decide that you'd like to be a judge?
I kind of, it's an interesting story. I was feeling a little bit stagnant as the Reno City attorney, and I was kind of looking around, and I was actually looking at North Las Vegas, and the city attorney there was going to step down. That's an appointed position. It's a 4-day-a-week, they work 4/10s. And I was thinking that might be real interesting. And so I was really looking into that very seriously. And then that city attorney called me back and said he'd found out that he had a very serious health condition and he was not going to leave. He was going to come back. But at that time, I'd already started thinking about leaving. And so I kind of looked around, and I saw that Fidel Salcido was up for re-election, and I went over, I know Fidel, and I went over and I said, "Are you going to run again?" And he said he was thinking about stepping down, and since I'd come and talked to him, that he would. And so that's when I decided to run for a judgeship.
And this was your second campaign for justice of the
The
peace.
same position, same exact position. Yes.
That you had lost before.
Right.
Did
right.
that give you some?
It was a little karmic, yes. Yeah, it was nice to win this time. Well, I actually kind of knew what to do and everything, you know. But it was interesting because the whole time I was, I was elected twice, and by then it was a 6-year term, so I served 12 years as a judge. But the whole time I was there, I still felt a little bit like an outsider because the district attorneys are the ones who come in and prosecute, and the public defenders in the justice court. And I came from Reno. I came from the city system. If I'd been a municipal judge, it would have been much more comfortable. And so, but on the other hand, I had a whole lot of civil experience in the justice of the peace do civil law. So I really had that area down and everything. So it was a it was a good job. It was and I was able to rule then on a lot of domestic violence cases. Some people felt I was prejudiced, but I think I moved over, put the neutral hat on. I found some people not guilty if the facts weren't there. You just tried the case in front of you.
And you've always faced that accusation, haven't you? And had to overcome the idea that you were pro-woman.
Yes, you can't be pro-woman, no. It was pro-victim is what it was, but right. It was seen as pro-woman, yeah. Right, yeah.
And you've managed to sidestep that and be fair through these years.
I think so. I think that I didn't always do that well in judicial surveys, and that was, I think, because of my strong stance on domestic violence. Mm-hmm. But I don't care. You have to do what's right. And you have to help these folks who are trying to get out of this situation. And if the system lets them down, then they won't come back. Mm-hmm. And we have to break these cycles. I have a story about a young man who came into the city when I was city attorney and said he wanted to intern, and he wanted to intern in our office. And interns, take some time because you have to, but we said, okay, we'll do that and everything. So he interned in our office. He was with us all year. He was a wonderful young man. He was a single dad and everything. The very last day that he was there, one of my victim advocates come in, and she's crying, comes into my office and she's crying. I was like, what's the matter? What happened? And she said, well, you remember, let's call him Jason. Sadly, I don't remember his name, but the story. She said, well, her office was in the library because we didn't have a lot of space. So he was kind of hanging out in the library, and it was kind of awkward. And he was kind of, and she said, do you need to talk to me? And he said, yeah. And he said, now this kid had worked with us all year, okay? And he said, do you remember so-and-so? And Lori said, yes, I do. And it was one of our horrible cases where the guy had, broken through the window and, crawled into the woman's bed and done all of this stuff. And he said, "That's my mother. That was my mother." And Lori just couldn't believe it, and she remembered that this young man had been thrown on the windshield on the car, and all of these things had happened, and that she had really fought to get counseling for him and to get help. I still tear. I can't believe it. Anyway, and what he said was, "Never underestimate the good that you do."
Oh, wow.
And that will take you a long way.
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody writes something nasty, mean on a judicial survey, I don't care.
So this young man had been a victim as well
Yes.
of seeing his mother
Yes. Yes.
being abused.
Yes.
And then grown up to want to do something
Right.
about
But
it.
there was still that shame, and I don't know what involved, that it took him that long to tell us why he picked our office and who he was.
Yes. Wow.
Isn't it?
And that makes it all worthwhile.
Yeah.
It
It
really
does. Yeah, if I don't do anything else.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. You do have an impact.
You do. You do. You do.
Even when you don't see the impact.
That's
it's
right,
there,
that's
you
right.
know, and you don't know that it's
You
there.
don't know. Sometimes you know. Sometimes you get the letter from the woman who says, "I hated you folks. You wouldn't let me drop the charges. Now I'm in med school and I'm going to work in this area. I've gotten away and I'm going to specialize in this." So,
Yes.
yeah.
Wow, that's a wonderful story.
Well, you can see why it stuck with me. So,
Yes. And then you recently, or just several years ago, retired from being a justice of the peace.
I did. I retired. I decided I was tired of campaigning. I didn't want to run again. And so I retired, and then I was sitting as a senior judge, and then COVID came along, and then it all dried up, at least at my level, it dried up. And I decided, well, I didn't mean to completely retire. I'm just going to retire. So I've gone back to work, and now I'm of counsel in a firm that does commercial litigation and all these, a far cry from what I did before. But it's interesting, and it's keeping my brain functioning, and they're nice people.
And now for something completely different.
And now for something different. That's right. That's right. That's true.
With everything you've done, how would you like to be remembered?
I would like to be remembered as a kind person who helped people, who made a difference.
And if you were writing a letter to your younger self, what would you tell her about your life that was coming up?
I would tell her not to be afraid. I would tell her that you have more power than you think you do. That when that high school counselor told you you had low test scores and so you shouldn't go to college, and you told her you were going to law school, you had the right idea. That believe in yourself and don't be afraid.
And persist.
And persist. You have to persist. Absolutely. Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.